Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Lenovo Legion 7 on the left and the Asus Zephyrus G15 on the right. Now, before we get started, the first thing you need to know is that the Legion 7 has not launched in the US at the time of this video. This was sent over for review, but it should be launching sooner than later. It is available in some regions around the world, but again, the US is not one of them. The G15, on the other hand, this is my daily driver. This is not a review unit. It has a skin on it, so it doesn't look like the G15 would typically, but we are working with very similar internals, although on paper, the G15 does have superior specifications, and I'll get to that in a moment. The first thing I want to look at is display quality. We have a 16-inch 2560 by 1600 resolution, 165 hertz refresh rate, IPS panel, again the first of its kind with that 16 by 10 aspect ratio. And then on the right we have what was the first of its kind, 15.6 inch, also 165 hertz, 16 by 9 aspect ratio IPS panel. So both have the same refresh rate but slightly larger and a different aspect ratio with the Legion 7. Let's take a look and a listen to their performance. Brightness is at 100% for both of these machines. Both are matte displays. You'll notice the black bars at the top and the bottom. That's because, again, the Legion 7 is a 16 by 10 aspect ratio. A little blown out simply because of the brightness being at 100% here. Let me stop it right there. So the takeaway, at least in my opinion from this, is that they both have really good displays. Neither is in the OLED realm. Obviously, you're not going to beat an organic light emitting diode display. They are best in the business, but when it comes to high refresh rate, these are gaming laptops, you're not going to find a 165 hertz panel in the OLED world either. So as far as IPS, that's in-plane switching, tech goes, you're looking at bleeding edge for both of these. Now, in my personal opinion, I'm going to call this a wash. I do happen to like the 16 by 10 aspect ratio, but letterbox is not going to be for everyone. This is really a matter of personal preference. I don't think one is specifically better than the other. I think they're really close, and that's because they're the same tech. But, of course, you are getting more resolution with the Legion 7. So that is important to note, but it's vertical resolution, and that's why when it comes to 16 by 9 content, which is what I produce as a content creator, I do favor the G15. However, I would be just as happy with the 16-inch new panel that Lenovo is using. And when I say new, again, that's subjective because they're both really new. This was the first time ever that we saw a 165 hertz panel, that's 1440 resolution, and now we're seeing the first time that we've got a 1600 resolution 16-inch panel ever. So important to note. So I think it's kind of a wash. Now, when it comes to audio quality, that's the next thing I want to touch on. They both are pretty good. I don't think you'll be blown away, but I think they absolutely achieve what they should in their form factor and class, and especially price point. The G15, I didn't mention pricing in this build specifically with the AMD Ryzen 9 5900H, and the RTX 3070 is priced at roughly $1,850 US. This is the model from Best Buy. RGB backlighting on the keyboard. You may have noticed we have per key RGB lighting with the Legion 7, but we don't have pricing yet. This sports a Ryzen 7 5800H as well as a 3060. So slightly inferior specifications with the heavier Legion 7. But again, let's now take a listen specifically to the Legion 7. See the RGB coming to life as well. Stop it right there, and now let's take a listen to the G15. We are at 100%, just verifying. So, in my opinion, the audio is really close, but I think it's a little bit better on the Legion 7 than on the G15. Let's move away from the display and audio performance and talk about keyboards. Now, both are really good. I think that clearly the first thing you're going to notice beyond the RGB per key on the left, as opposed to RGB but not per key on the right, is that there is no numpad. You do not have a numerical keypad. So if you need the numpad, obviously the Legion 7 is the way to go. If you don't care, if it's not critical, I will tell you that the G15 keyboard, I think, is slightly better than the Lenovo, believe it or not. At least to me, it feels like we have more key travel with the G15 than we do with the Legion. But it may be almost identical. I mean, I couldn't tell you that you've got to go with the G15 because it has a better keyboard, because they are that close in performance. And again, if you care about having a numerical pad, well, then there's nothing to even talk about with the G15. Let's get out of this and let's talk about some more elements that I think are critical to making a purchase like this. Another thing you may have noticed is that we have a webcam at the top center of the bezel. There is no webcam on the G15. So that's something that may or may not matter to you. Of course, I purchased the G15 knowing that it didn't have a webcam, and that's a sacrifice that I don't think most of us should have to make. We're still in a pandemic. It doesn't really make a lot of sense even if we weren't in a pandemic. Let's talk about build quality. All aluminum here. Pretty much, almost 100%, a little bit of polycarbonate, but even the deck is aluminum, whereas with the G15, predominantly plastic. There is some metal in this build, but that also is the reason the G15 is significantly lighter. We're looking at 5.5 pounds for the Legion 7, and we're looking at roughly 4.5 pounds for the G15, and that's without the power brick. The 300-watt brick for the Legion 7 is tremendous. The power brick, the 200 watt for the G15, on the other hand, is much more reasonable in my opinion. You may have also noticed all of the RGB lighting running around the machine. Now, of course, you can disable that, and that will also result in better battery life. But if you're looking for a gaming laptop and you feel that's part of the identity, you have that option here with the Legion 7. You do not have that option here with the G15. So really a matter of personal preference yet again, but to the point again about the bricks and battery life, the G15 far superior on battery life than the Legion 7. Now that may change when the Legion 7 officially launches here in the US. A lot of people have been talking about the IQ software and that Corsair software is a battery drain, which it is. But I cannot, in good conscience, tell you that if you uninstall the IQ software, you'll get X amount more of battery life, because that is not going to be what the majority of users do. If they're buying this and they like the RGB lighting, they're not buying it with the intent of disabling that. So as it stands, if you're wondering about battery life, you are looking at, with the G15, more realistic battery life for something that wouldn't remind you of a gaming laptop, which is part of the reason that I really love the G15. It's a love-hate relationship, which I'm not getting into here. If you want to check out my reviews on this, then you'll find that out there. But if you disable the GPU, eGPU mode, you can get 7 to 8 hours of battery life, which is pretty amazing. With the GPU on, though, that's where they become very similar, which you're looking at really 3 to 4 hours off of the brick, depending on what you're doing, which is a lot for gaming laptops, but not a lot for laptops in general. And right now, if I look at what's estimated here, 61%, an hour and 38 minutes. And with the G15, I do have the battery conditioning on. We're at 34% with 46 minutes. So you can see they're really quite comparable when the GPU is enabled. Again, we have a 3070 in this build with a TDP that maxes out at 100 watts. And here we have a 3060 that maxes out at, I think, roughly 130. So With that said, let's talk about the gaming performance, because the GPU is going to be principal not just to gaming, but also to video, photo editing, in-application software that can actually make use of it. Of course, the CPUs are both competent. They're both AMD's latest and greatest. Of course, the Ryzen 9 in here, 35 watts as opposed to the 45 with the Ryzen 7 5800, but the Ryzen 9 in here is a superior 8-core chip to the 8-core inside of the Legion 7. How much in real-world use? Not that much of a difference. When it comes to benchmarking, they're not that far apart either, even though better CPU-GPU combo here. By the way, 16 gigs of RAM stock in this build, 8 gigs of the 16 in this configuration are soldered to the board, something I absolutely hate, but that's part of the love-hate relationship. Now, I have upgraded to 40 gigs of RAM by throwing a 32 gig DIMM in here. That did help give me extra headroom that I needed, but let's stick to the 16 gig world. Something you should know about the CPU is that with the Ryzen 7, you max out at 32 gigs, at least to my knowledge, whereas with the Ryzen 9, you max out at 48. So that's the reason I was able to push this to 40. If you go with the 3080 build that comes stock at 32, you see where you can go with that. So something to be aware of. But when it comes to something like 3D Mark and benchmarking, I pulled in the highest score that I got here was a little over 8,700, whereas with the G15, I'm consistently over 94 and 9,500. Now, what does that equate to in gaming? Well, I've got things like Rust, Call of Duty, Valheim, Battlefield 5 on here specifically, Cyberpunk, and I even have GTA on here. Frame rates are really similar. Close enough with the 3060 with the extra wattage to the 37 with the lower wattage that I felt this comparison was totally legitimate. And I expect pricing to be really similar. I mentioned $1,850 for this. It originally launched at $1,750. Pricing went up because of supply and demand, I presume. And it's being sold by third-party retailers for even more. You're looking at something over $2,000. This machine is supposed to be somewhere between $1,700 and $2,000. And that seems like a lot, but when you take into account what I just mentioned here, I won't be shocked if we see it coming in at higher than $1,700. The upside to Lenovo is that they are a bigger manufacturer than Asus, which means we will see discounting, I think, more heavily with the Legion 7 over the lifespan of the product, whereas the G15 will simply be replaced. I mean, the M16 is right around the corner, and if I had that, I would compare it, but then we'd also be comparing Intel to AMD, and part of what I like about this comparison is that we're getting AMD versus AMD, of course, with NVIDIA in tow on both of them, and both of these processors are brand spanking new. So, as are the displays. I mean, this is part of the beauty of 2021 for gaming and content creation. Both displays, by the way, are fairly color accurate. That's another really nice thing about them. I am drawn to this display, but again, purely at this point, for a laptop, I prefer 16:9. For general monitors, though, 16:10 has been a standard for me for over a decade. Now, the next thing you need to know, thermals. How do they perform? I haven't seen any heavy throttling with either of these. Of course, the G15, because it's thinner, lighter, it is more prone. But I don't really think that you're going to run into anything, whether you're gaming or editing 4K video or using these machines in Photoshop or Lightroom with raw images. You're not going to really run into any true bottlenecks. I haven't, at least. So that's part of the beauty of both the Legion 7 and the G15 is that they are workhorses in a form factor that traditionally you wouldn't expect. And again, from a gaming perspective, and I didn't emphasize this enough, the beauty of both of these is that with pretty much any title you throw at them, you will be able to max it out at the native resolution of the display. Now with the G15, you're going to fare a little bit better. With the Legion, on the other hand, as it puts itself to semi-sleep, dims the display for power saving purposes, you basically in a title like Cyberpunk, for example, if you try to max things out, because of that extra resolution, again, 2560 by 1600 as opposed to 2560 by 1440, QHD versus WQHD, you are going to want to drop some settings down. And you could offset that but the point is, native resolution, both of these are going to be able to play pretty much anything you throw at them. Now, if you want to take that to an external monitor, that's another story altogether. But when it comes to native gaming on their 165 hertz refresh rate displays, both of them are going to be up to snuff. So a lot of people have said, oh, when will I get a Legion 7 with better specifications? Not the base configuration, which this absolutely resembles. The truth of the matter is, I think this is going to appeal to a lot of consumers because you don't necessarily need the 3070 or 3080 when you have 130 watts to that 3060. It is a really competent GPU in spite of the fact that it has 2 less gigs of video RAM compared to the 3070. Beyond that, HDMI 2.1 is present on the Legion 7. We do not have that with the G15. You will need to use one of the Type-C ports. I'm going to go over I/O in a moment in order to get 4K 120 hertz out of this, which you absolutely can do. Now, with a game like Cyberpunk, you know, you're pushing it a little bit, but it's playable. You're talking about, you know, somewhere between 25, 35 frames per second. But with older titles, you can easily achieve 40 to 50 frames per second, believe it or not, out of the G15, and similarly with the Legion 7. So that's still really impressive, which was pretty much unimaginable until this generation where 4K gaming has really been realized. Under heavy load, both of these are going to spin up and make quite a bit of noise. That's to be expected, but neither is going to burn your lap. So when it comes to heat, as I mentioned earlier, both Lenovo and Asus have done a pretty good job with keeping these machines cool. A lot of people will say the G15 runs hot even when it's idling. You know, compare that to previous generations or some Intel processors. Granted, 11th gen gaming laptops haven't hit my studio yet, but they will soon. And I still think these fare pretty well, even if temps get hot. They're not going to physically burn you. So let's talk about the I/O, because that's pretty much the other area. And I'll give you my final thoughts on both of these, even though I own this one and this one's a review unit. So when it comes to I/O, and by the way, you can open both of these with a single hand. I know a lot of people love to harp on that, and I don't really see the value. But for those of you that want to know, you're fine. A little bit of screen wobble, by the way, with the G15. I forgive that because it's obviously not a touch screen. There's no way to do any sort of input, no pen input. The Lenovo, on the other hand, has less. And this speaks to the build quality. And in my opinion, and I didn't, by the way, before I get to that, touchpad. Can't believe I left that out, covering all my bases. Both are really good. Obviously, the touchpad, trackpad on the G15 is larger. If you care about that, if you want something bigger, the G15 is your option, obviously. But I see absolutely nothing wrong with the Legion 7. Another thing to point out, power buttons, obviously, center on the Legion, far right on the G15, and some dedicated function buttons like the Armory Crate, mute, and volume. Don't have that here, but you have plenty of function keys to offset that. Another thing you should be aware of is that when plugging in and disconnecting the power brick from the G15, it will switch from the 165 hertz to the 60 hertz refresh rate for obvious reasons. With the Legion, you have to change that on your own using a function key combo. So it's not going to intelligently. That may change when this is officially launched in the US, but just something to be aware of. Also, all activity lights are right here, and a lot of people also worry about the ventilation that is here blowing against the frame of the display. I'm not personally worried. I think this machine will last. That's why I own it. If that, made me insane, those two things, I wouldn't have kept it. But build quality definitely goes to the Legion 7. I mean, when it comes to flex in the display itself, it's more rigid. This, again, is plastic, and there's a lot more aluminum with the Legion 7, but you feel it in the weight of the machine physically. So that's something to be aware of. But overall, the build quality here is definitely superior. Now, styling, aesthetics, whether or not you like it more, is completely up to each user respectively. Let me go ahead and back those up. And you can already see physically why the Legion 7 is bigger. It's thicker. Again, a metal chassis, aluminum really, whereas here we're predominantly polycarbonate. Again, this is a skin, if that wasn't obvious. But a quick tour around the G15 for those of you who are not familiar with it, on the left side of the machine is where all of the I/O magic happens. The quick charge dedicated port, your HDMI 2.0B, Ethernet, Type A, and then you have two Type-C ports that are both capable of power delivery, so you can charge this with a traditional Type-C 65-watt charger. It will be a slow charge, whereas the included 200-watt brick, which I'm going to bring out in a moment, will get you charged up in roughly an hour and a half, a little over an hour, which I think is great. And throughput on the Type-C ports, we don't have Thunderbolt. Obviously, this is an AMD build, but you get very close to a gigabyte a second. So that is definitely very, very good in my opinion. Ventilation, the activity lights that I was just talking about. I don't love the placement, but nothing is perfect. This machine still performs very well. And on the right side, Kensington lock, more ventilation, micro SD card slot, which I think is a must-have in my opinion, and another Type A port. That is it. Really clean, plastic, pretty much all around. And if that bothers you, the G15 simply isn't the right machine for you, in my opinion. We've got T6 Torx screws all over the place. Pretty easy to get into this thing. And the only thing, again, you're going to really be upgrading is the RAM and the NVMe. This does not support Gen 4 drives. Of course, you can use a Gen 4 drive, but if you followed my upgrading tutorial, you know you've got to be careful with what you throw in here. I tried to put in a 4 terabyte drive as the primary, and I just couldn't get it to work. So presently I've got the stock Hynix 1 terabyte as the primary drive, and I have a secondary 4 terabyte Sabrent drive, a Rocket Q, and that works beautifully. So 5 terabytes, not too shabby. Again, the G15 is my machine for a reason. It's modern, it's light, and it really does give me all of the power that I could want in a laptop that is still a laptop and not really a notebook, even though it falls into the notebook realm. Now, the Legion, as I said, build quality absolutely goes to Lenovo on this. Styling, if you're looking for something that really exudes the gaming theme, this does that, but also keeps it sedate. So if, like me, you don't want it to look like a gaming machine, and again, forgive the fact that I've got a skin on here, this, I think, actually looks less like a gaming machine when the RGB is off. But when the RGB is on, it's like, it's party in the front, or in the back, however you want to look at it. The point is that this thing can change with a flip of a switch. The G15 has a little bit of a rainbow effect. It's really actually the film from the IPS panel with holes exposing it. I wanted that covered because I just feel like that's another way for dust to intrude. But let's take a tour around this beast. And this instantly feels much heavier because it is. It's a pound, and that's without the power brick. Don't worry, I'm still going to show you what those look like. So obviously, the Legion logo does some glowing in hibernation charging. It lets you know what's up. Love the ports at the back. Wish we had this luxury with the G15, but we don't. So we'll get there in a moment. Legion branding right here at the lip. Really clean. This, by the way, is not so easy to get into. I have not taken it apart for that reason, because it's a review unit and I'm not going to be upgrading it. But again, the fact that the RAM is not soldered is nice. There are two slots for NVMe drives, just like the G15, so very similar. The bottom, ventilation here, you see the Legion fans. It's attention to detail. Lenovo gets credit for that. I think this is a really well-appointed machine, and it's not gaudy or ostentatious, and it doesn't turn me off personally. The left side of the machine, headphone, microphone combo jack, just like on the G15, of course. And then you have one Type-C port. This can be charged using Type-C, but you're going to want to use the 300-watt included proprietary brick. On the back, again, this is where ports belong, and they've given you an ample supply. We've got the proprietary 300-watt, again, charging port from the brick. And then we have Type A, HDMI 2.1, two more Type A's, and yet another Type-C and Ethernet. Flip it around, and we've got another Type-C and a privacy switch. So what is missing, folks? No card reader. Now, for many of you, this may be irrelevant. For me, it's relevant. and it's one of the reasons I own the G15. I'm not saying it's one of the reasons I wouldn't own a Legion 7, because I do think the Legion 7 promises to be one of the best gaming laptops of this year. Legion branding on the hinge, you may have noticed that. If you didn't, I'm pointing it out now. And that's pretty much it. The LED strip that runs all around that you saw lit up at the top of this video. Again, really a matter of personal preference if that's for you, but I think Lenovo did a really nice job when this is plugged in and powered on and any of these ports are in use. They are illuminated, and I just think that the Legion 7 feels like a much, I would say, better made product than the G15. The G15 inherently feels a little bit disposable because of the all-plastic body. Can't get around that. The trade-off is much lighter, obviously, than the Legion 7, as I've stated through the course of this video time and time again. Now for the power bricks. Let's look at them because it's relevant. I mean, one I feel like will sit comfortably in your bag and the other will not. So let's start with the one I own, which again is the G15, a little bit dusty, but that's because this thing doesn't travel. As I stated, we're still in a pandemic. There is the 200 watt power brick, and it's fairly normal. Quick charging on here, as I stated, an hour and a half basically to full charge. I have battery conditioning set to 60% because this pretty much lives on the nipple for me right now, the nipple being this, for those of you with dirty minds. And when you have something permanently docked to a power source, do yourself a favor and let the battery conditioning do its job. Otherwise, you're going to shorten the lifespan of that battery. So let's go ahead, scoot that back, drop that there so that it stays in frame. And let's get to the real large brick, which again is the 300 watt brick that you'll find across the entire lineup for the Legion 7, no matter what build you end up with. I'm trying to get this to stay. It's just trying to pull itself off. Here is the 300 watt beast for the Lenovo. So this to me is one of the biggest drawbacks, but again, if you're in the market for something really powerful, this is, what the responsibility that comes along with it. And the good news about this brick is that it does charge up the Legion 7 really quickly, actually faster than the G15. And both of these have very large batteries, but you're looking at a little over an hour, just like with the G15, with the Legion 7. So, does this matter to you? Again, it's a matter of personal preference. But this brick is basically twice the size of the 200 watt brick for the G15. And I thought it was important to know. I mean, as this continues to slide, it's just, again, when the time comes that you actually want to travel with one of these, know that the G15 is going to travel a lot better than the Legion 7. And that's part of the reason I'm rubbed the wrong way by the fact that the Legion 7 doesn't have a card reader, because it's such a beefy, heavy machine. Granted, not heavy in context of what it's capable of, because I do think it's fairly lightweight. I mean, in days past, a machine with these sort of specifications and this capability would be significantly heavier. And we've got that new 16-inch screen, which I think is a showstopper. I mean, both of them have brilliant displays. Now, which is right for you? That's a question of what you plan to do. If the machine is never going to travel, the Legion 7 seems like the obvious winner, especially, if you need higher specifications to match what's in the G15, you're going to have that ability. I mean, you're going to be able to spec this thing out. And they'll eventually have Intel builds too, which I think is going to be really intriguing with the 11th gen chips and Thunderbolt 4. I mean, that's where I would be focused. But this is what's available now, or at least soon to be available. This will be out sooner than the Intel build. That's why I have it for review. So, just recapping here at nearly 30 minutes, unscripted as usual, this is my daily driver for a reason. When I bought it, granted it was months ago, I knew what I was getting involved with. It is not perfect, but at a little over 4 pounds, really hard to beat its CPU, GPU combo, the display quality, battery life, all of those things. It's just still really hard to beat it. But if you're put off by the soldered RAM, if you're put off by the nearly all plastic build, and you can all chime in and tell me it's not predominantly plastic. I love my G15, but it feels like a piece of plastic for a reason. then clearly this is the way to go. There are other options in the market, don't get me wrong, but I feel like these are two of the most premium, and they reflected in their pricing. Granted, the G15 was looked at as a bargain when it was $1750 US, but now we know it's $1850. It's in stock. That's the good news. The Legion 7, when it comes to market, we'll see what the price ends up being. Again, I don't have final numbers, but I do think that for most users, the display is better than the G15, because most users, I think, will prefer the 16:10 aspect ratio. Some games will not support it. The majority will support 16:10. So don't get put off and think, well, I'm going to try to game with this and then the aspect ratio isn't going to be supported. It likely will. In addition to that, would you be better off with a 3070 or 3080 in this build? Yes. With the extra resolution, I do think the 3070 is the sweet spot. I don't really see the value in going 3080 on any of these laptops, especially when you have 130 watts. The 3070 should scream. The difference in CPU, as I mentioned through the course of this video, is marginal. Granted, this is the better CPU. It actually gets less wattage, 35 versus 45. Which is another interesting thing, but the performance difference is so marginal that in real world use, you aren't going to see it at all. I don't want to say kind of like Gen 3 versus Gen 4 NVMe drives, because there is a big difference there, but how much you're going to see in terms of software actually utilizing it is where that difference gets mitigated. So the Legion has better build quality. I think the better display overall. It's larger, higher res. That for me is a win-win. I also love the screen to body ratio on this thing. I mean, the G15 is nice, but it has a giant chin. There's no way around it. You don't have that with this machine. You know, the chin on this doesn't feel like a modern machine compared to the screen to body ratio on the Legion 7. So there's a lot to like there. Also, you know, this has a webcam, this has a numerical pad, slightly smaller trackpad, touchpad, but that may or may not make a difference to you, just like the lack of an SD card reader of any form. So better I/O, in my opinion, on this machine, no question about it. The HDMI 2.1 in itself makes it better, but the G15 isn't really missing too much, is it? You know, both of these will play nicely with Thunderbolt 4 docks because they are backwards compatible with traditional Type-C machines. I've tested both. And you do have power delivery through Type-C. So if you are traveling and you forget the brick, you can use any Type-C power delivery. But remember, you will not be able to get full performance out of either of these without the brick. So you are going to want to have the brick if you plan on doing any real gaming or real heavy lifting in the software world, whether we're talking about, again, photo, video editing, any sort of graphic design, you're going to want to have that power brick. That's just a fact of life. But hopefully that rounds it out. I mean, these are two great machines. I don't think you'll go wrong with either one, but I feel like there's a reason I picked the G15 and it still stands up, thankfully, today. Now, the question inherently that I will be asked is, if I didn't own the G15 and this was a review unit, which would I pick today? In all likelihood, I would probably go towards the Legion. However, that is being said without knowing what pricing is going to be, and pricing is always relevant. If somehow the 3070 on the Legion ends up being a $2,500 machine, I absolutely would go still with the G15. I don't think that will be the case. I think these are going to be competitive when it comes to pricing. So, just food for thought. But there's no question I prefer the Legion 7 in just about every single way, except for what I've stated through this review, which is its overall weight, and of course, possibly it being significantly more expensive than the G15 in the 3070 build that I have here. So again, if everything could be done over today and they were the same price, then things become a little bit more tricky, because then the only thing the Legion 7 is missing is a card reader, and I would not shun a very well-built beast of a machine like the Legion 7 simply because it's missing a card reader. And that's coming from me, a content creator that really does need to have a card reader, but this is still really compelling, and the 16-inch panel they've employed is the first of its kind, and we're going to see every manufacturer follow suit, including Asus. That's coming, as well as Dell. Everyone is going to employ it. So I really think the Legion 7 is a gem, and I'm not off-put by, the RGB-ness of the machine, because it can all be disabled. But again, those of you who've been saying, give me the battery life with iQOO uninstalled, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Because you're buying this machine with RGB as being part of what you're paying for. If Lenovo decides to make one without the RGB lighting, we have a different conversation entirely. But the G15 I'm still really happy with. I have no regrets in this context. The other thing is the Legion does not have soldered RAM, so that's a knock against the G15, obviously, but I'm happy with my 32 gig upgrade to get me up to 40. Things are working really well. So don't get too hung up on synthetic benchmarking. Remember, when it comes to gaming and editing, these are going to be really similar, simply because there's a lot more power going to the 3060. But I am really curious what the 3070 is going to do. Again, the 3080 I think is just unrealistic, and it's like, if you just want to buy the most expensive machine, you can do it, but how much performance you're going to gain is likely not going to be worth it. Similarly, to picking a 3090 over a 3080 Ti. The 3090 will outperform it. NVIDIA has made sure of that, but for real world use, will that difference be something relevant to you as a consumer? Likely not. So both really good machines. Hope you enjoyed the video. Again, I'm really happy with the G15, and I'm glad that at the end of the day, this is still the more portable machine, because down the road, I do plan on traveling, and this I will happily take with me. This would get a little bit too heavy, in my opinion, and that is the only downside really to the Legion 7 outside of the missing card reader, because it literally has everything else. So I'm going to be very curious what Lenovo does with the Intel builds as well. I think that's going to be of particular interest to me, because the one thing I really miss from both of these is Thunderbolt for connectivity and throughput. I've got a lot of Thunderbolt NVMe drives, and I get close to the capability with the Type-C throughput we have here, but still can't achieve that 1.25, nearly 1.5 gigabytes per second that Thunderbolt gives you. So that's the juice I'm missing, but still really happy with my G15, and I think anyone who picks it up is going to be. But quality control issues, for those of you that followed my coverage, were suspect at the very beginning. Asus has been able to iron things out, but everybody's got horror stories with every manufacturer. As I've stated, no one is perfect, but both of these are really good machines, and it's a great time to be looking at gaming laptops here in 2021, when you can do just about everything with them. When years ago, people used to argue about why you shouldn't go beyond full HD. Those days have thankfully passed. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe.